But this was posted on my X page recently. I'm going to read you something that was an update to the story from the Britannia Hotel, which we talked about last time. So if you remember the story from last time, the Britannia Hotel has become home to a bunch of illegal migrants, military-age males. And there was an incident where a young lady had her property trespassed into by this young male. And we were told that there was no real reason behind it, and locals came and removed him, and the police couldn't do anything because he was only trespassing and it doesn't constitute a criminal offence. And later on then, they arrested the tenant of the property. And there was a lot of, allegations as to police malpractice and all stuff like this, based on, obviously, a lot of prominent examples that we have now as well. But this is something I believe that was screenshotted from Instagram that somebody put up on X. And I believe it is from the sister of the tenant of the flat whom the young man trespassed into. So we've got a lot of things to read. I'm going to read you the status and talk about it as I feel that I need to, but there's a lot of troubling things in this that we shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing now. We shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing these whatsoever. There's just more and more examples of the diagnosis when we already know the problem. Many people don't want to admit the problem, especially in areas like mine where things like this haven't made themselves feel, haven't changed or, provided the full scale of the problem yet. I'm struggling for words at the moment. My brain's not there. But because I live in an area where the problems are not as pronounced, right, as certain areas where you've had complete demographic change, you've basically had an ethnic cleansing of native British people in a lot of these areas, even in some of the big cities like London. You look at the big cities in Wales, for example, you see it clear as day. But in smaller towns, it's yet to make its presence known. Okay, but it is coming. It is coming, especially if Plaid Cymru get their way, as I'll show you later on. But on the 13th of August, this is from the statement now, so I'm quoting from the statement which I've got here, and it'll be linked down below in the show notes or in the description. On the 13th of August, just before 6 p.m, a man housed in the Britannia Hotel on the Isle of Dogs entered my sister's flat without permission. To provide context, my sister had only been discharged from intensive care the previous day. She has kidney failure, is on dialysis, is blind, a type 1 diabetic, suffers with arthritis, and uses a wheelchair, to name a few of her ailments, right? With her back to the front door while mopping, Shanae, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. It's spelled Chanay, which in turn is this person's niece, and I don't know who the person. The person who's writing this is obviously the sister of the person who the flat belonged to. I don't know her name in this context. The niece turned to find a man inside the flat. He stood silently with a blank, scary expression, one hand in his pocket, another on his groin, or the other on his groin. He ignored repeated demands to leave and continued towards her. Fearing for her life and her mother's safety, she grabbed the nearest object to force him out. So already, some of the stuff that we got told before already doesn't add up. Okay, we were told that, this person was just inside there not doing anything. But quite clearly, and this is why I said, and I pointed out a double standard last time with regards to the undercover operation, that these things could very well be indicative of a further crime that's going to be committed, when they said that catcalling was apparently going to be an offence that is a preliminary to other things that are going to happen. Standing in the doorway with one hand, which is the only exit point outside of the window, I would imagine, is far more of a sign that something bad is going to happen and further offences are going to take place. And you'll understand that a lot of the things which I said last time, which in my opinion are basically just common sense, are corroborated by this lady's statements, as we'll get into later on. But you wonder, what's in the pocket? Could be a weapon. Why has he got his hand in the pocket? Could be a hand on the weapon, right? Ready to draw it. Why has he got his hand on his groin? He's fixated on something, and his hand is obviously taking over with an automatic gesture, right? Most likely. So it's quite clear what this person, at least in my opinion now, was looking to do. Very lucky he didn't have chance to carry it out, right? The fact of the matter is, she had to grab a weapon to force him out. If that doesn't constitute now criminal trespass, I don't know what does. I don't know what does. Once outside, members of the public intervened after seeing Shanae in distress. This is when the recordings start. Okay, so I would imagine that's when we saw the recordings of the police outside, for example. Go and check out number 43 if you want to go and see that footage, right? The man was detained through citizen's arrest whilst the police were called. The police arrived and swiftly dismissed the man's actions as trespassing, which is exactly what we saw in the video, not being a criminal offence, and informed us he will be returned to the hotel. Outraged, we walked to the hotel to protest his return. So, let's have a little bit of a recap. That's the end of the first part. We've got 4 of these to go through, by the way. That's one done. We've got 4 of these to go through. It's a lot of text to go through. This way, it shows not only the danger that you're in because of these people that we've imported en masse, right? And if you say that kind of stuff, if you say the kind of things that I'm saying now, be prepared to lose people in your social circle over, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, especially living in an area like mine. That the police were keen not to do anything. This speaks to the ideological rot, which is in the case of the police department, because they've gotten the victim and oppressor, the victim and criminal complex completely inverted, right? To the point now, again, we are showing sympathy to the criminal and cruelty to the innocent, and we are persecuting the innocent and allowing the guilty, allowing the criminals to go free. And this is why I can't understand how, when they were told this, they didn't seem to search the guy. Okay, so I would imagine that the niece, Shanae, in this instance, if noticing that the guy had his hand in his pocket, maybe would have suspected that he would have had a weapon of some kind. Could have just, might not even been like a knife or anything like that, or a gun, God forbid. It could have been some kind of, binding, agent, if you will, or binding object, like a little bit of rope or a zip tie or something like that to, prevent resistance from doing something that he wanted to do. Right, but you have a heavily immunocompromised lady in this room, and this young man, so obviously going to be quite strong, right? So obviously he's a young man, he's going to be in his prime, right? Has turned up, and it's just 2 young girls there who, well, one young girl, and I'm not sure exactly how old the sister is, but one immunocompromised lady and one niece. They're not going to be able to do much. They're not going to be able to do much, make no mistake about it, outside of using an object or weapon of some kind, right? So smart for her to do. But what we'll see is now that the police just turned up, and as they seem to have a tendency to do at the moment, just make every single situation worse. They just make every single situation worse. Because this caused, as we get on to the next part of the statement now, emotions to heighten. And during a confrontation with the Britannia hotel security, Shanae pushed past the security guard. Shanae is a 22-year-old woman, around 5'3" and weighing about 47 kilos, and was hardly a threat to a grown man, which the police obviously agreed with too, as they were present at the time and had the power to arrest her if they felt she was a threat. Instead, they created a story that she ran at him with a meat cleaver to strengthen their charge. So this is to be believed. They completely fabricated a story against this innocent lady who was just doing her best to defend what we can presume is her mother, right? Because if it's the 2 sisters and it's the niece, it's going to be her mother that she was protecting, right? Her heavily immunocompromised mother. And understanding that the police weren't going to do anything. This guy was just going to get off scot-free, which, by the way, from what I've heard, this isn't the first time this has happened with this guy, whatever the hell his name is. No surprise, by the way, doesn't speak English and anything like that. No surprise. A short while later, we learned that the same man had tried to enter another home earlier on the same day on the Isle of Dogs. This incident was reported to 101. There were time-stamped images of and a CAD number to prove this. Despite informing police, they had no intention to investigate further. To cover their ass, they fabricated a story that the man had entered my sister's flat, quote, to seek safety, unquote, after being chased. This is untrue. This man did not enter my sister's home distressed, and he did not ask for help, and he also failed to leave when asked. And I speculated that might have been the case last time. I speculated maybe this guy was out walking. Okay, he shouldn't be in the country anyway, right? He shouldn't have ever been let in. He shouldn't be in here. But say he was out and he accosted some people that noticed him, and due to seeing all of the things that are happening in their country, they're angry, and they just wanted to take it out on somebody. Right? We're seeing the sad, very sad, natural reaction to these things, which is people are going to start hating these people, right? And violence is going to start to erupt. It's very sad. And he might have been seeking refuge. I speculated that might have been a cause last time, right? However, the actions would have been a lot different. If somebody was seeking refuge, wouldn't have had his hand in his pocket, hand on his groin. Both hands would have been up. And even if he might have been trying to use hand gestures to communicate if he can't speak English that well, right? He's, might be doing this, for example, like a pleading gesture. Obviously, that wasn't happening. So there is no reason, again, why the police are trying to cover for it in this way. Other than they are, as I've said time and time again, they're not on the side of the victims now. They're directly on the side of the persecutors. And they show what side they're on time and time again. Okay, not all of them. Not all of them. But certainly the ones at the top espousing this ideological corruption and disgusting rot are. Around 7:30 to 8 p.m., police pulled me and Sinead aside for a private conversation. They told us the man had been identified at the hotel, which, by the way, they still haven't released any, information about this guy, his name, where he's from, anything like that, right? As far as I know, they still haven't released anything. And apparently he's been detained, or he was detained, but they claim they couldn't question him as he wasn't cooperating and didn't speak English. They presented this as if they were taking real action, giving us false reassurance and making us believe they understood and sympathized with our situation. Let's get on to the next part straight away, ladies and gentlemen, because now you're going to see how they really did not sympathize with their situation. This was all just a lie and a ruse, as we've seen from the police time and time again. Later that evening, so that was about 7:30 to 8 o'clock, now around 9:30, 9 p.m., so around an hour and a half to 2 hours later, the same officers returned to the sister's home. This the immunocompromised sister who's just been released from ICU, by the way, and it was obviously her daughter that tried to defend her from whatever this man was thinking of doing, claiming to update us. Instead, they gained entry under false pretenses, which is why you've got to be so careful now, ladies and gentlemen. Got to be so careful, which is why people have been briefing me. Some people that I've spoken to on the podcast, some of the guests that I've had have briefed me on some of the things that I've got to be careful of with regards to, if the Stasi ever were to turn up at my door with the things that I'm doing now, for example. You have to be very, very careful. You have to be very, very careful. Especially when you open your door and you say, come in, because it's quite clear they'll use any pretense they can to get into you, to get into your home, right? So it would obviously look very, very bad if they came with battering rams and all stuff like that, for example. Remember, your home is private property, ladies and gentlemen. It is still at the moment anyway. And you should get yourself, skilled up, rather, on your rights and stuff like that. Maybe put notices on your doors. Maybe it's worth doing that anyway now, regardless of who you are and stuff like that, because it's going to be you at some point. It's going to be you at some point. Even if you're a zealous or regime zealot at the moment, it's going to be you. Make no mistake, it comes back to eat everybody. But they gained entry under false pretenses and arrested Sinead for assault and possession of a deadly weapon. Despite searching the flat, no weapon was found. They recovered a small amount of personal cannabis, which is the offence of Class B drugs. Whether that is medicinal, I do not know. But again, that's an offence. You can't really say too much about that. It's classed a Class B drug, so you can't really say too much about that unless obviously it's some kind of medicinal use, right? But I'm not sure if we have that kind of stuff in the UK. I know in Canada they're very big on that. For the most part, they have a lot of marijuana legalization for medicinal reasons and stuff like that, and I think you can get certain exemptions in the UK and stuff like that, medical use exemptions, all those kinds of things. I'm not an expert on that, I'm not going to speak to that, but whether it was a case of it was just a medicinal use amount, I'm not sure. Sinead was shocked and confused as to why the same officers who had just shown her sympathy had suddenly turned against her. With two officers already holding her arms, another officer grabbed her by the neck. She panicked and kicked out in fear and accidentally kicked an officer, so they added an additional charge of assaulting a police officer. That's just disgraceful. That's just disgraceful because you have a 5'3", 47 kilo, for the sake of argument, let's just go with the person's measurements from before and say they're accurate. It does not take much to restrain that person, right? If you're genuinely trying, especially if you're a man. So they don't specify who the two officers are, but presumably she's not going to be posing that much of a threat. Why do you then need to go and grab her neck? Why do you then need to go and do that? There's no reason you should be doing that. She's already detained. There's no reason anybody else other than those officers who were detaining her should be putting their hands on her. That's a natural reaction, in my opinion. Not justifying violence against police or anything like that. But what are you going to do? You don't know this officer's intentions. We've seen that some of these police officers are the most evil people on the planet with the things that they've been in. The alleged officers that have been raping children in their cars and saying they'll give them back to the rape gangs if they say anything. There's good pretense for you to be very wary of police nowadays. You know, that they're politicized, you know, enforcement arm. They're not there to protect and serve, at least not your interests. They're there to protect and serve government interests, and they'll do any evil thing, seemingly, to enforce the government interest. They're not here for the safety of society anymore. There's no justification for this, in my opinion. All this happened while my disabled sister was crying at her window, begging for me to come in and help her, unable to understand why her home was being searched or see what the officers were doing. So presumably this is where the video was that we saw before. Presumably it would have been around this time that the officers would have arrested Shanae, and the lady we heard speaking in that previous video was this woman's sister, who said it was my sister's flat that got broken into, right? So thinking back to that video now, ladies and gentlemen, the whole situation was so distressing to watch. My youngest niece was on the floor having a severe panic attack and now has a fractured foot from an officer treading on her foot during the chaos. Should seek any action they can against these officers, in my opinion. She absolutely should. This situation was handled poorly by inexperienced officers who lacked empathy from the very start and failed to protect my vulnerable family members, because all the empathy and humanity has been deliberately drilled out. They've been deliberately drilled out of our police force, and that makes it very, very scary. That makes it very, very scary, because that's exactly what they did in the Soviet Union. That's exactly what they did in Mao's China and all these other places, right? They drilled out any kind of humanity and empathy, right? Because everything, it's only the regime that matters. Everything only matters in the context of the regime. You know, and enforcing the regime's interest. Anybody who seems to be getting in the way of that is to be treated, you know, as one of the red identities, from Mao's time, right? Anything goes at that point. So I hope that they can seek some kind of penalty from these officers, right? Because not only are they massively overstepping their bounds and acting like fucking bullies rather than, you know, justice operatives, then now they've injured somebody, which could then result in them being, you know, having effects for the rest of their life in a completely preventable situation if it had been handled properly. So yeah, they should try and take them to the cleanest as much as possible. Maybe that's the only thing that's going to actually hurt the police things. They don't necessarily care about the bad press or anything like that. They're only going to care about it when they actually start suffering some material consequences, right? This ordeal is even harder to bear knowing Shanae's history. At 18 years old, she was the victim of a knife attack, slashed in the face by a man still on the streets. She lost sight in her left eye and has been struggling with PTSD and anxiety ever since. No charges were ever brought against her attacker, despite the entire incident being on CCTV, and there were witness statements. Another example of failed policing and failed justice system. So admittedly, you might not be able to expect the officers at the scene to know that, right? But this is why they should be approaching this situation, which is why there's no good argument to say why police officers shouldn't train and be made to feel as vulnerable as their victims all the time, right? In something like jiu-jitsu with somebody that's a lot more experienced than them, right? Because then they'll go into this situation a lot differently. They'll completely rewire their mindset when they realize how vulnerable they will be if they come across the wrong person, that they can feel as though they could throw their weight around and act like bullies and arrogant and prideful and satanic almost when it's a young, you know, scared 18-year-old, less than 50 kilos, you know, doesn't even come, you know, comes up to like my shoulder, maybe not even that high, a female. But then when it's the wrong person, in potentially irrelevant of size, and then they are made to feel that that fear and that helplessness that they made their victims feel, that'll be when the true change comes. That'll be when the true change comes. A bit like Khabib Nurmagomedov. He says, I like to take them out to deep water and they will discover themselves. You know, that kind of fear, right? That kind of fear, that helplessness, like you're drowning. Okay, it's scary. It's very, very scary, but it's powerful. It's powerful. And a lot of these officers need that. A lot of these officers need that fear. And it will change the way they approach these situations no matter who it is. It will change the way they approach these situations no matter who it is. So they'll go into it thinking, you know, I ought to treat everybody with respect here because I know how it feels to be in that helpless situation. Sinead has since been remanded in custody until the 12th of December. So for defending her, immunocompromised mother, and for then assaulting a police officer after she was assaulted herself, in my opinion, she's now remanded in custody till the 12th of September. Makes you think, what's going to happen to the mother now? She's a vulnerable young woman who cares for her full-time disabled mother, who cares full-time for her disabled mother. Meanwhile, the man who walked uninvited into her home, terrifying my family, faced no charges, no accountability, and no restrictions. What's stopping him from coming back and doing a heinous act when him knowing now that the young girl has been arrested and there's not going to be anybody there to stop him, most likely? What's stopping him from coming back and doing whatever heinous thing he's going to do with this immunocompromised lady that is basically easy prey? And we've seen there's no limits for these people. There's no limits for these people. They'll do absolutely depraved, disgusting things. All right? So now this lady from the police interaction, this immunocompromised lady, has been left in severe, potentially even mortal danger. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. And at the end of this paragraph on the statement, it says, terrifying my family, faced no charges, no accountability, and no restrictions. So much so, he went on to assault another person in the Hackney area. It says it all, doesn't it? My family has been left sickened, shocked, and deeply disappointed by the way Sinead has been treated. Situation highlights a complete failure of policing in action, accountability, and care for the vulnerable. We feel betrayed by a justice system that protects offenders over victims and abandons the very principle it is meant to serve, because the earlier incident had been properly investigated. Had the earlier incident been properly investigated, he would have never been able to enter my sister's flat. The police also told us that they had confirmed the man's identity at the hotel, yet none of his details had been released. However, my niece's details were. So another clear example, I've talked about it time and time again, that Axel Rudakabana, we couldn't know anything about him after the Southport attack because it might prejudice the trial, and they tried to then spin the narrative that it was a lovely little Welsh choir boy that must have had just a manic episode and it was completely premeditated, and it was done with Islamic motivations, right? Couldn't know anything about him. The only photo they released was that cutesy photo of him dressed up as Doctor Who when he was like 10 years old or something, right? But then when it's a white British person in particular, like especially a white British man, there was an incident that I can't remember what it was for. I think it was for a good couple of months ago. I think it was might have been just before Labour got in or just after Labour got in. That there was a guy come back and the police got him coming off of a plane, and they not only doxed his name, his surname, but also where he lived. Also his street address, and it was to do with, I believe, like a anti-Muslim, anti-Islam comments, right? So putting his entire family and the rest of his street in danger, because when you see that, ladies and gentlemen, from the mind of the people that would be offended and want to go enact some kind of retribution for this stuff, nobody's off limits with regards to that. They'll go after family, they'll go after everybody, as I'll move on to now in a moment when we talk about some of the horrific things that have been said to reform, I believe it's a reform candidate, Dame Andrea Jackson? Is it Andrea Jenkins, sorry, Andrea Jenkins. Some of the horrific abuse that she's received, and some of the horrific things that's been said to her. So again, it's not just you that's in danger, it's your family as well, which is why these people cannot be allowed to be here. Cannot be allowed to be here. Say what you want. Us, normally, if we have a problem between individuals, we settle it between ourselves, right? We settle it between ourselves, and we understand women, children, and family, they have nothing to do with it, they're off limits. Right? That's typically how we understand things. We've lost that grip and understanding in recent times, but that's typically how it was understood. Right? Not with these people. Not with these people. They'll go after your family. They'll go after your kids. There's no honor with these people. There's no honor with these people whatsoever. Someone trespasses into your home, you should not have to wait for your belongings to be stolen or your body violated before being allowed to defend yourself. Every person has the right to feel safe in their own home and community. It's absolutely true. Like I said, the double standard is clear and evident, because when it was catcalling, quote unquote, against the undercover police officers or honking or whatever, the police came in and pulled them over and arrested 18 people for non-crimes because of the possibility or what it would indicate of a further crime being committed. But they did not arrest this guy for the same quote-unquote non-crime under the suspicion that a further offence could be committed when there is far greater suspicion for a further offence being committed with regards to this guy than there ever would be with a person whistling at a jogger as she runs past in see-through fucking shorts, right? Okay? There's absolutely no comparison. But this is the complete inversion under the two-tier system that we have. This is bigger than just family or my family. Time and time again, the police have shown us they're not here to protect or serve the public. All of this could have been entirely avoidable with proper policing. This was the perfect opportunity for the police to show the community that they have our best interests at heart, but instead they failed to understand their duty of care. This is about an entire community left unprotected, all about lies told to cover up incompetence, about being abandoned by the very service we fund through our taxes. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's just truly, truly disgusting. And this is the danger that happens when these guys are possibly the most important force, the most important public institution that needed to maintain their principles and needed to adhere to them, right? So reason why, again, that when dictatorial coups happen or whatever, that when a government decides it's going to turn evil, it's so dangerous because they have access to the police, they have access to the military, they have access to all of these things that have so much dominion and control over people's lives, and people have so little recourse to be able to deal with it when that happens. A gang of police officers turn up at your door. There's very little that you can do because they are backed with the legal authority and the ability to put you behind bars and separate you from your home and your family, potentially for life. Right? So they have a complete monopoly on force. If you have a complete monopoly on force, that's a massive, massive responsibility that requires you not only as a force, but as an individual to maintain virtue and to be accountable to something greater than that. Which is why ultimately this is not necessarily just a problem with any of the one political things that we have going on, with any of the myriad political issues going on. It's a problem that we've decided we don't want to be accountable to the Almighty anymore. That's the problem. That's the problem, because it bred pride, and pride has led to all of this. Pride in thinking that we can just do whatever the hell that we want, basically, that we're accountable to no one. And to me then, as soon as you have pride, you have a fall coming right after. And all of the evil atrocities that have occurred throughout history pretty much have come from pride one way or another. Pride in thinking that you don't have to be accountable to anything bigger than yourself, right? And pride in institutions thinking that they don't have to be accountable to anything bigger than themselves, right? That's why. That's why pride is the chief. That's why pride is the chief of the cardinal sins.